In this video, we're going to be learning about the uterine cycle, which is the second half of the ovarian-uterine cycle pair that make up the female menstrual cycle. Now, what I just said is actually a little bit of a misnomer because the ovarian and uterine cycles actually happen concurrently, meaning that the ovarian cycle doesn't happen first and the uterine cycle doesn't happen second. They actually occur simultaneously because the hormones that are produced by the ovaries directly have effects on the uterus. So throughout this video, we're going to look at which hormones from the ovaries directly line up with what's occurring in the uterus. Now, we start at the beginning of a uterine cycle, but also, rather paradoxically, at the end. Now, how is this possible? Well, simply because the end of a uterine cycle, day 28, has the same event that is occurring on day 0 of the next cycle. And that, of course, is the process of menstruation, also more commonly known as the female period. So as we can see in this uterine diagram, the inside layer of the uterus, the endometrium, is breaking down in a process of controlled cellular suicide because, once again, there is no need to maintain this endometrium because the egg was never fertilized. Now, because the unfertilized ovum is not needed to be kept in here because it's not going to be developed into a fetus, the unfertilized ovum and all of the broken down endometrium are going to be released out of the female vagina, and this is the most recognizable part of the female period. Now, at the end of one menstrual cycle, the uterus will need to prepare itself once again for the possibility of pregnancy, meaning that the endometrium that was just broken down and released out of the uterus needs to be regrown again, and the hormone that is necessary for that is, of course, estrogen. Now, here's where we can connect this process back to what's going on inside of the ovaries. So we know that estrogen is produced by the small cells outside of on the outside of the follicles, the granulosa. So this means that this regrowth, which is what we call the proliferation phase of the uterus, is directly connected with the follicular phase inside of the ovaries, because the follicular phase is the one characterized by the mass production of estrogen. Now, that estrogen is going to migrate from the ovaries via the bloodstream and trigger the cells in the inside of the uterus, the endometrium, to begin the process of regrowing themselves, and that's why this process is called the proliferation, because proliferation is just a fancy word that means growth. However, as we can see here, the uterus is not quite mature in terms of its structure and its ability to grab onto and hold onto a fertilized ovum, because estrogen alone is not enough in order to get the uterus ready for pregnancy. So sometime in between the proliferation phase and what we call the secretion phase inside of the ovaries occurs ovulation, that being the release of the mature ovum as it migrates from the ovaries through the oviducts, during which fertilization will occur. Now, that means that after ovulation, in this section here, is going to be occurring the luteal phase, meaning that LH from the pituitary gland has turned the granulosa into the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum, as we learned in the previous video, has one primary function, and that is the production of the second reproductive hormone in females, progesterone. And the fact that progesterone is active at this stage, the secretion phase, tells us that this lines up with the luteal phase in the ovaries. Now, what does progesterone do, and why exactly is it necessary for the maturation of the uterus, and why is it so regarded as the pregnancy hormone? Well, in order to answer that, we can simply remember the functions of what the uterus is meant to do during the process of pregnancy. Now, the primary function of the endometrium is to supply the growing zygote or fetus with nutrients that it needs to grow and oxygen that it needs to breathe, meaning, as we can see from the deep red color of the uterine tissue here, that there is going to be much more blood flow to the endometrium, and this, of course, is mediated by progesterone. However, all of these nutrients and oxygen would be wasted if the fertilized egg, the zygote, is not able to attach to the uterus. And yes, it is possible that the fertilized zygote would be lost and would just pass right out of the uterus through the vagina and exit the female body. And that's where the uterus is required to produce mucus, which is the sticky substance that is found on the walls of the endometrium that will allow an easier implantation of the zygote into the walls of the uterus so that it can benefit from the nutrients and oxygen that are being supplied via increased blood flow. Now, obviously, during the pregnancy period, the zygote is going to grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, so naturally the uterus needs to be able to relax in order to accommodate more space for the fetus, but also the uterus will eventually need to contract in order to push the fetus out during the process of birth, and that's why an increased muscle mass, so increased growth of the myometrium tissue, is another factor that is mediated by progesterone. Now, if no fertilized ovum has made it to the uterus by this time, that means that all of this effort has actually been for nothing. And if no fertilized ovum has been implanted within the endometrium tissue by the time that the end of the menstrual cycle has been reached, then menstruation begins once again, and the entire process starts again with a new menstrual cycle, preparing the uterus once again for the possibility of pregnancy. Now, the final thing that we need to talk about is, let's say, for the sake of argument, that fertilization is successful and we have a fetus that is now growing inside of the uterus. Now, at this point, will the female uterus want to undergo menstruation? Will the female want to have a period if the fetus is growing inside? Now, the obvious answer is no, because if menstruation occurs, then all of the endometrial tissue will be broken down, which means no blood flow, meaning no oxygen and nutrients for the fetus. But more obviously, all of that degraded endometrium tissue is going to exit the uterus, and if that happens, it will take the fetus with it. So obviously, a pregnant female who wants to keep the baby will not want her period to occur. So what exactly stops this process from happening in the event that pregnancy is successful? Well, the short answer to this is the zygote itself. So the zygote is the fertilized egg that makes it to the uterus and implants. Now, if there is an actual fertilized egg that has been implanted into the walls of the uterus, the zygote itself produces another regulatory hormone, which is what we call human chorionic gonadotropin. Now, once again, if you don't want to go around and say human chorionic gonadotropin every time you refer to this hormone, we can simply call this H for human, C for chorionic, G for gonadotropin, and human chorionic gonadotropin is actually an inhibitory hormone in that it stops the entire process of menstruation from occurring, thereby preventing the fetus from being thrown out of the uterus along with all of the endometrium tissue keeping it alive. In the next series of videos, we're going to look in more detail at the interaction between the ovarian hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and how those hormones more specifically regulate the process of the uterine cycle.